"You'll never keep this farm, Richard. You're too old, too slow. By the time spring comes, you'll be nothing but a burden." Those were my brother's words, spoken not with kindness, not with hesitation, but with a smirk that seemed to curl deeper the more the neighbors nodded. It was the day we sat in Father's old kitchen, the table where our family once bowed their heads in prayer before meals. But this time there was no blessing, no silence of gratitude. Only signatures, papers, and my name missing. I remember staring at the document that carried the weight of our father's legacy. My father who rose before dawn, who built fences with callous hands, who pressed my shoulders when I was 12 and told me Richard the land rewards patience. Yet when his will was read and the farm divided, patience was treated as weakness. My younger brother Martin slid the papers across the table with the confidence of a man who had already counted me out. His sons, my own nephews, leaned against the doorframe, their laughter barely muffled. To them, I was already a relic, an old carpenter who had spent too many years fixing other men's roofs instead of plowing his own fields. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I pressed the tip of the pen against the table, tapping it once, silence, and then I set it down. Inside, though, something shifted. The farm was more than soil. It was more than fences and barns. It was the rhythm of life stitched into my blood. I had spent years working the land alongside my father, through storms that bent trees sideways and winters that froze the cattle's water trough solid. I'd been there when Martin was too young to lift a spade. I'd been there when my nephews were still chasing chickens barefoot in the yard. But sacrifices fade quickly when profit is on the table. When my back began to ache, I chose carpentry to provide steady income. I thought my brother would keep the land while I worked elsewhere. I thought blood would mean loyalty. I thought wrong. Now, sitting at that table, I could smell the faint smoke from the old wood stove. I could hear the scratching of pens against paper as they transferred what had been our family's pride into their names. And above it all, I could hear my brother's voice again, slicing the air like a blade. "You're past your prime, Richard. Best let the young men carry the load." He thought age was a curse, but I knew better. Age was a ledger, every slight, every wound, every sacrifice, carefully noted. And patience was the interest that grew quietly waiting for the right season. I left that day without a word. Snow had just begun to gather along the fence line. Each step I took away from the farmhouse felt heavier but sharper. The air was cold enough to bite, carrying the metallic scent of winter on its breath. I didn't look back because I knew if I did, they would see the flicker in my eyes, the one thing I wanted hidden. Not anger, not desperation, but certainty. I walked the long path back to my small house on the edge of town. The boards creaked beneath my boots as I entered, the familiar scent of pine and varnish still lingering from my last carpentry project. My tools lined, the wall hammers, saws, planes, each one a reminder of a life spent building, repairing, and waiting. And as I stood there in the dim glow of the lamp, I whispered to myself, barely audible, "By winter's end, Martin, you'll see just how useless I really am." At night, I lay awake, the wind pressing against the windows like restless hands. Memories drifted in uninvited. Father's voice telling me that land belongs only to those who respect time. Mother's hands folding bread dough while humming a hymn. And Martin always restless, always greedy, always certain that he was the better son. I thought of the way he looked at me across that table, as though I'd been erased already, like chalk washed from a slate. I thought of my nephew's laughter, sharp and cutting, as if my years of sweat on that farm meant nothing. And as the hours stretched on, the plan began to take shape, not sudden, not violent, but deliberate. A seed planted deep in frost, waiting for the thaw. The first step was silence. Let them believe they had won. Let them mock me. Let the community whisper that old Richard had been outsmarted. I would let their pride grow unchecked like weeds in an untended field. Pride, after all, is the best fertilizer for a man's downfall. I visited the farm less and less, walking only along the public road to watch from a distance. I saw the changes, fences, neglected equipment, mishandled debts, whispered about at the feed store. Martin was not my father. He was not even a farmer. He was a gambler, dressed in overalls, relying on credit more than craft. The land noticed, and so did I. Winter is patient. It strips the trees bare, hardens the ground, forces every creature to test its endurance. And while Martin and his sons drank and laughed, believing their hold on the farm was ironclad, I watched. Quietly, patiently. Because I knew something they didn't, winter isn't an end. It's a pause, a preparation. And when the frost finally settled deep into the soil, it would not be them who claimed the harvest. It would be me. The humiliation didn't end in Father's kitchen. No, Martin made sure of that. At the town diner where farmers gathered for breakfast before the sun climbed, I overheard him more than once. His voice carried through the smell of bacon, grease, and coffee, always a little louder than necessary. Richard's bones are too brittle for the fields. Best he stick to his hammers and nails. And the men laughed. Not cruelly perhaps, but with the kind of laughter that agrees without thought. It was easier to nod with Martin than to question him. He was younger, louder, and carried himself like the rightful heir. The worst came one Sunday after church. As people filtered out into the crisp air, my nephew David leaned close to me with a grin stretched wide and whispered, "Uncle, if you need work, maybe I'll let you muck out our stalls. Pay you $1 a day." The words stung, but not because of the insult. They stung because he said it without fear. He believed I had no strength left, no pride worth protecting. He believed, as Martin did, that my silence was surrender. But silence is not surrender. Silence is strategy. I remember walking home that day, boots pressing into the thin crust of snow, each step crunching like brittle glass. My breath trailed behind me, vanishing into the pale blue sky. Inside me, however, nothing vanished. Every word they spoke, every smirk, every gesture I stored away like logs stacked for winter. At night, I sat by the lamp ledger book open. Not of debts I owed, but of debts they did. Martin's bank loans whispered at the grain store. The new tractor bought on credit, he had no means to pay. The fencing materials left to rust because he never finished the job. The farm wasn't thriving, it was bleeding. And I, the useless old man, was the only one patient enough to watch it drain. One evening, the wind howled fierce across the fields, rattling the shutters of my small house. I lit the stove and warmed my hands, staring at the flame. Memories came again, but this time they were sharper. Father teaching me how to mend a plow, his voice steady, "Never rush, Richard. A tool breaks when you force it." I thought of those words, and I knew they applied to more than wood or iron. They applied to revenge. A rushed strike snaps. A patient strike holds. I began to visit the courthouse quiet as a shadow. Saturday in the back, listened to land auctions, learned how debts turned soil into numbers, numbers into bids. I spoke to no one, but I memorized everything. Meanwhile, Martin grew bolder. He strutted at gatherings, speaking as though the land had always been his alone. My absence from the farm became his proof. He said I was finished. He said I had chosen the easy road, leaving the hard work to him and his boys. The town believed it. Why wouldn't they? A man who does not speak is easy to paint however you wish. But I didn't mind the picture he painted. In fact, I let him paint it darker, because the darker the portrait, the more shocking the light when it changes. Winter deepened. The fields froze hard and the cattle grew lean. I heard whispers of unpaid feed bills of equipment repossessed under cover of night. Martin's pride kept him smiling in public, but I knew the truth. I could see it in the way he avoided the banker's eye on Sunday mornings, the way his boys grew restless when talk of debts arose. I waited. Each evening, as frost crept up the window panes, I sat at my desk ledger, open pen in hand. I recorded dates, names, amounts, not to expose him yet, not to shame him yet, simply to hold the rope as he tied his own noose. Because revenge like winter requires patience. The turning point came quietly. A notice pinned at the courthouse board, auction of farmland January. I stood there in the hall, hat in hand, staring at the paper. Martin's name printed bold beneath the word delinquent. A chill went through me sharper than the winter air outside. Not of fear, not of pity, but of clarity. This was the moment my father's words echoed once more. The land rewards patience. Martin had mocked my patience, had called it weakness. But patience had been my plow cutting, straight, steady lines through years of humiliation. Now the field was ready for sowing, and the harvest would be mine. That night I sat alone at the table, the lamp casting long shadows across the wooden boards. I placed my hands flat upon the surface and whispered, "You told me I was too old, Martin, too weak, too slow. But winter is long, brother, and I have endured every one of its nights." I leaned back, closing my eyes, the fire snapping softly in the stove. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a thin smile because I knew with absolute certainty that when the auctioneer raised his gavel and the room fell silent, it would be my voice calm, steady, and final that ended this chapter. "One bid," I murmured, "and your land will be mine." Season 2, Part 1 script. I wasn't always the quiet man they mocked today. Once I was the one who rose before dawn when the frost still clung to the windows and the only sound in the house was Father's boots striking the wooden floorboards. I followed him into the fields at 12 years old, hands still soft back, not yet bent. The soil was frozen, then crusted white, and the plow's blade had to break through it inch by inch. My fingers burned from the cold, but Father only looked down at me and said, "The land doesn't wait for a boy to grow, you must grow with it." And so I did. While Martin stayed in bed, a boy too young to understand responsibility, I was beside Father mending fences, carrying feed, learning the rhythm of the land. By the time I was 15, I could fix a roof patch, a wagon wheel, and coax a stubborn cow into the barn during a storm. It wasn't talent, it was duty. And duty was the marrow in my bones. When Mother fell ill, it was me who shouldered the burden. I left school before the others did, picking up odd carpentry work in town to pay for medicine. Father never asked, but he didn't have to. I saw the worry in his eyes, the way he counted pennies late at night by the dim light of the lantern. Martin, meanwhile, was always restless. He liked the fairgrounds, the laughter of girls, the clink of coins over card games. He claimed farming was dull, that he was made for better things. Yet when harvest came, he returned basking in the pride of work he hadn't sown. I never complained. That was my flaw, perhaps. Silence. I told myself blood was stronger than resentment, and one day Martin would see. One day he would grow into the man Father needed him to be. But some men never grow. They only take. When Father passed, it was sudden. The kind of quiet death a man earns after a life of toil, in his chair, boots still on hat, resting beside him. His hands were folded, as if even in death he was ready to rise at dawn. I carried him to the graveyard myself. The coffin heavy, but not as heavy as the knowledge that the man who taught me patience would never see what patience had cost me. That evening, Martin stood at the edge of the field, smoking, and said, "Well, Richard, I guess it's all ours now." I remember staring at him, the smoke curling upward like a lazy lie. I wanted to believe he meant ours, but deep down, I already knew what he meant. Years went by, and I kept the land alive. When drought came, I rationed water with careful hands. When storms toppled the barn roof, I climbed it alone, hammer in hand, nailing every board into place while lightning split the sky. When cattle sickened, I slept in the stalls, tending to them through the night. But the more I gave, the less they saw. Martin brought his boys around, showing them the land as though it had always been his. They laughed when I worked slow, when my back ached, when my hands trembled after long days. "Old Richard," they called me, though I was only in my 40s then. Still, I said nothing, because Father's voice stayed with me. The land rewards patience. So I told myself the reward would come. That family would remember. That sacrifice meant something. But sacrifice without memory is nothing but erosion. And over time, even stone wears away. I think often of the night I chose carpentry. It wasn't because I loved the craft more than farming. It was because Martin squandered money and someone had to keep the family afloat. A carpenter's wage was steady, while a farmer's harvest was uncertain. I worked on other men's houses, watching their families sit down to meals through lit windows while my own family sat on the farm I was paying to keep alive. I brought money home, gave it to Father, and went back out again, hammer in hand. I thought I was saving us all. But when Father died and the papers were drawn, those years vanished like smoke. The wages, the sacrifices, the long nights alone in strangers' attics and barns, gone erased with a stroke of ink. And when Martin looked at me across that table and said I was too old, I realized what had truly aged me. Not time, not toil, but betrayal. Now, as I sit here by the fire, the ledger on my desk, I can almost hear Father's voice again. His lessons weave through the crackle of the wood. Patience is not waiting, Richard. Patience is preparing. Perhaps he knew this day would come. Perhaps he knew Martin's pride would rot the roots of everything he touched. All I know is this: my life was not wasted. My silence was not surrender. My sacrifices were not forgotten, not by me, not by the land. And when the moment comes, when the gavel falls and the field is offered to the highest bidder, my years of sacrifice will speak louder than Martin's years of arrogance, because the land remembers who bled for it. The papers came on a bitter November morning. I remember because the frost was still thick on the windows and the sound of crows carried sharp across the fields. Martin stood in the kitchen sleeves, rolled his boys at his side, their eyes shining with something between pride and greed. The lawyer unfolded the will pages, crisp, his voice steady. I listened, waiting for my name the way a man waits for spring after a long winter. But when the list of heirs was read and my brother's name filled the lines where mine should have been, I felt the air leave my chest. My name wasn't forgotten, it was erased. Martin leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and gave me a look I'll never forget. Not of pity, but of victory. As if all those years of labor had been a game and I had been the fool who played it without knowing the rules. "You understand, don't you, Richard?" he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "You've worked hard, but you've had your life. The farm needs strength now, not worn hands." His sons laughed. One of them muttered just loud enough for me to hear, Old men can't even carry a bale without wheezing. Their laughter filled the room, echoing off walls that had once held our family's prayers. I wanted to speak. I wanted to slam my fist on the table, to shout that every beam in that barn, every fence post in the field carried my sweat. I wanted to demand that they look me in the eye and call me useless after everything I had given. But I didn't. I sat in silence, my jaw clenched so tight I could hear the grind of my own teeth. The pen lay in front of me, the ink ready to stain the page with finality. I picked it up, tapped it once, then set it back down. That was my answer. Because words shouted in anger vanish. But silence lingers. After the meeting, I stepped outside. The sky was gray, the kind of sky that presses down on you heavy and endless. My boots crunched through the frost as I walked away from the house. I didn't look back though. I could feel their eyes on me, could hear their voices fade into the distance. The path home felt longer that day. Each fence I passed, each tree that stood bare in the cold felt like a witness. The land itself seemed to know what had happened, as if it grieved with me. When I reached my small house, I didn't light the fire right away. I sat in the dark, the chill wrapping around me like a shroud. My hands shook not from cold but from the weight of betrayal. For decades, I had been the one who sacrificed my schooling, my wages, my body, my time, all for family, all for land. And with a single decision, they had stripped it all away. That night, I wrote in my ledger. Not numbers, not debts, not plans, just one sentence. They took my name, but not my patience. Days turned into weeks, and the town followed Martin's lead. At the diner, I heard whispers, "Richard's done. He won't be farming anymore." At church, people patted my shoulder kindly as if I were already a relic. At the feed store, the owner asked if I was selling my tools since I wouldn't be needing them. I smiled politely. I said little. I let them think I had given up, because men who think you are finished stop watching you. And when they stop watching, you can move in silence. Winter deepened, and with it my resolve. I saw the cracks forming in Martin's hold long before he did. His pride blinded him, his debts growing like shadows at dusk. He thought my silence was weakness. He thought my absence was defeat, but I was there watching, always watching. One evening, as snow fell steady outside my window, I sat by the fire and closed my eyes. I could almost hear Father's voice again. "The land rewards patience, Richard, but it punishes arrogance." I whispered back my voice steady in the empty room, "Then punish him, Father. Punish him through me." That night marked the shift. No longer was I a man nursing wounds. I was a man preparing the soil for the slowest, coldest harvest a brother could reap. And though they had erased my name from the will, they had written their own downfall in ink I could already read. Because winter had only just begun. Betrayal doesn't always come in one strike. Sometimes it comes in pieces, small cuts that bleed slow until you realize you're hollow. For me, it began with whispers. At first, I thought they were rumors, that Martin was selling off portions of the land, small acres here, a boundary there. But when I walked past the old Northfield one morning, I saw the fresh survey stakes, the earth marked with bright red flags. That land had been ours since Father's father laid the first fence post. It was the place where I had once raced barefoot, where our mother gathered wildflowers before Sunday supper. And now it was parceled off, measured in feet and dollars. Martin saw me standing there. He smirked, the cold air clouding from his breath. "You wouldn't have used it anyway, Richard," he said. "Best it go to someone who will." I didn't answer. I simply turned boots, crunching through the frost, and walked away. But inside, something cracked deeper. Not from the loss of land, but from the realization that Martin no longer saw me as family. I was an obstacle to be erased, nothing more. Weeks later, I went into town for supplies. The banker's clerk, a thin young man who always looked nervous when speaking, stopped me at the door. "Mr. Hale," he said, "your brother signed as sole head of the estate. Any inquiries will go through him now." His words stung sharper than the cold wind outside. Sole head. As if I had never worked those fields, never bled into that soil, never sacrificed years to keep our family fed. I nodded, thanked the boy, and left. At the diner, I overheard my nephews bragging. "Father says Uncle Richard's done. He hasn't got a stake left. He's just a guest in town now." They laughed. Loud, careless, the way young men laugh when they believe the world bends to them. One of them noticed me sitting 2 booths away. He raised his cup of coffee and called out, "Don't worry, Uncle. Maybe we'll let you tend the garden behind the farmhouse if you can still kneel." The diner erupted in laughter. Some laughed awkwardly, not wanting to join, but too timid to stand against Martin's boys. Others laughed freely, enjoying the spectacle. I stirred my coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the cup. My face betrayed nothing, but inside each laugh was a nail hammered into memory. Betrayal is sharpest, not when strangers deliver it, but when your own blood twists the knife. I thought of the nights I carried Martin on my shoulders when storms scared him as a boy. I thought of the shoes I bought his sons when they were young with money I should have spent on myself. I thought of every sacrifice, every silent choice, and how they had been reduced to mockery. And still I stayed silent. Because silence, I reminded myself, is not weakness. It is the soil where strategy grows. That winter grew harsher than most. Snow piled high and winds howled like wolves across the fields. I watched from my window as Martin's sons struggled with the cattle unprepared for the labor they thought beneath them. They shouted, cursed, and left tools in the snow rusting overnight. The farm was not cared for, it was consumed. Every decision Martin made was not to nurture the land, but to drain it. To take what he could while the soil still offered something. And the soil noticed. Fences sagged, roofs leaked, animals thinned. What once stood as a legacy became a slow ruin. But Martin didn't see it. Pride is blind. He saw only his reflection in the glass of the diner windows, the way people nodded when he spoke. He didn't notice how those same people whispered when his back was turned. One night I was at the courthouse, warming my hands by the stove in the lobby. The auction board hung on the wall, notices pinned in neat rows. And there it was, another tract of our family's land listed for sale. I stood there for a long time, my eyes fixed on the paper. Around me, men came and went, stamping snow from their boots, laughing, muttering about debts and harvests. But I didn't move, not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. It was confirmation of what I already knew. Martin's betrayal wasn't a moment, it was a pattern, a harvest of arrogance, season after season. And patterns can be predicted and used. When I left the courthouse, the night was still. The snow glittered under moonlight, each flake sharp as glass. I paused at the edge of the street, breath curling into the dark, and whispered to myself, you think you've buried me, Martin, but winter buries all men, and when the thaw comes, only one of us will rise. I turned and walked home, the silence of my boots against the snow louder than any words I could have spoken. Because I understood now, betrayal wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The thing about betrayal is this, it feeds itself. Once a man chooses greed over family, he can't stop. He convinces himself the next lie, the next sale, the next loan will fix what he's already broken. But all it really does is dig the grave deeper. Martin was no different. By January, the town had started to whisper. At the feed store, I heard it first. He borrowed again. Signed papers with the bank. Promised to harvest he can't deliver. At the diner, the talk grew sharper. New tractor on credit. 2 months behind already. And at the courthouse, the truth stood plain, pinned to the auction board, more land slipping through his hands. To the town, it was gossip. To me, it was scripture. I wrote it all in my ledger, each note a nail in the coffin Martin was building for himself. One evening, I walked past the farm. Snow lay heavy on the fields, and the barn doors swung loose in the wind. Cattle huddled inside their breath, rising in clouds, their ribs too visible for the season. Martin stood near the porch, a glass of whiskey in hand, his sons laughing beside him. They were planning something, another sale, another gamble, their voices carrying into the night. I stayed in the shadows watching. Old Richard doesn't know a thing, David said, his laughter cruel. He's nothing but a ghost. Martin chuckled, lifting his glass. Let him be. Ghosts don't matter when the land is ours. Their arrogance burned hotter than the whiskey in their cups. And I let it. Pride blinds a man faster than drink ever could. The betrayal deepened when they used my name. At the bank, I discovered it by chance. I had gone to withdraw savings from my carpenter's work. The clerk shuffling papers looked up nervously and said, Mr. Hale, your brother listed you as reference on his loan. Said you'd vouch for his ability to manage the land. I stood there, silent, my breath caught in my chest. My name, the very thing they had erased from Father's will, was suddenly useful again, but only as a tool for their deceit. I leaned on the counter, looked the clerk in the eye, and said calm and steady, I vouch for no man who forgets his blood. Then I turned and left. My boots echoed on the wooden floor, each step marking the distance between my past loyalty and my present resolve. Betrayal has a way of stripping illusions. By then, I no longer saw Martin as my brother. Blood may tie men by birth, but loyalty ties them in life. And Martin had cut that tie long ago. Now he was nothing more than a man blinded by his own greed, sinking deeper each day. And I, the ghost he mocked, the relic he dismissed, was the one keeping record of every misstep. That winter was merciless. Storm after storm swept across the land, burying the fields in white silence. The roads iced over barns, creaked under the weight of snow, and the town huddled together against the cold. I spent those nights by my desk, the fire crackling low, my ledger open. I wrote by lamplight, every entry neat and careful. Debts, auctions, witness failures. Sometimes I'd pause listening to the howl of the wind against the shutters and I'd hear Father's voice again. Patience, Richard. The land rewards patience. I would close my eyes, nod, and whisper back, I'm patient, Father. I'm waiting. Then came the slip that sealed Martin's fate. At the diner Lau would drink, he bragged to anyone who would listen. By spring, I'll double the herd. By summer, I'll buy out the neighbor's lot. You'll see Hale land will cover half this county. The men around him chuckled politely, but I saw the glances they exchanged. They knew the truth. Martin was drowning. I sat 2 tables away, my coffee cooling untouched. Every word he spoke, every promise he couldn't keep, I recorded later that night. Not because I needed the proof, but because patience isn't just watching, it's remembering. The betrayal reached its cruelest point one Sunday. After service, as folks gathered outside the church, Martin walked up to me in full view of the town. His sons flanked him, smirking. Richard, he said, his voice carrying for all to hear, you look tired. Maybe you should think about selling that little house of yours before you can't manage it anymore. The laughter stung more than the cold wind biting my face. Neighbors tried to hide their smiles, but the damage was done. I met Martin's eyes. I didn't speak, didn't move, just held his gaze long enough for the silence to spread. Then I turned and walked away. The silence unsettled them more than any words could have, because words can be dismissed, but silence lingers. That night, I wrote the final line in my ledger for the season. They believe I am finished. Let them. By winter's end, they will learn ghosts can still claim the living. I closed the book, fed the fire, one last log, and sat back. Outside, the snow fell steady, blanketing the world in white silence. It would not be long now. By February, the town knew Martin was sinking. But Martin himself, he still swaggered through the diner, still slapped backs, still ordered whiskey he couldn't pay for. Pride is stubborn. It refuses to see the cracks until the roof caves in. I had no interest in mocking him. I wasn't here for petty satisfaction. My revenge would not come through words. It would come through silence, law, and timing. And so I began my preparation. The courthouse became my second home. At first I sat quietly in the back during small auctions watching. Farmers losing land to debt. Bankers exchanging quick glances as paddles rose. Men bidding with money that wasn't theirs, hoping for luck. I studied it all, the rhythm of the auctioneer's voice, the pauses that revealed hesitation, the sudden bursts of confidence that were more bluff than truth. I memorized the process like a carpenter memorizes the grain of wood, every knot, every line, every flaw. When the room emptied, I stayed behind speaking to the clerk. Not much, just simple questions. What happens if a man fails to meet his payments? How are bids recorded? Does family have priority? The answers came easily because no one saw me as a threat. I was the quiet old man in the corner, just passing time. But every word I heard I carved deep into memory. At night, I returned home, my ledger open lamp casting long shadows. I practiced numbers like a farmer practices sowing carefully, consistently. Every dollar I had earned from carpentry over decades, saved, modest, untouched by vice, I counted, stacked, and recorded. I sold a few tools I no longer needed, pared my life down to the bone. Because revenge, like winter, requires endurance. Meanwhile, Martin stumbled further. I heard his sons at the feed store grumbling that their father promised them money that never came. I overheard neighbors saying he had borrowed against next year's harvest, though everyone knew the soil was already tired. Still, he strutted, believing himself untouchable. Land is legacy, he told anyone who'd listen. Hales have always owned these fields. No bank, no man can take that from us. I smiled to myself when I heard it, because land is not legacy. Land is responsibility, and responsibility always collects its due. One evening, I returned to the courthouse and stood again at the auction board. There it was pinned neat and plain auction, Hale Farm South Tract. The words should have broken me. Instead, they steadied me. Because this wasn't loss. This was opportunity. I ran my hand lightly over the paper, feeling the grain beneath my fingers. My father once told me, when you hold the soil, Richard, you're holding time itself. And I knew in that moment the time had come. Preparation became ritual. Each morning I rose before dawn, brewed my coffee, and spread my notes across the table. I mapped the land, every acre, every field, every boundary line that Martin had neglected. I calculated debts against my savings, tested scenarios, rehearsed bids in silence. Neighbors thought I had withdrawn into solitude. They saw me less, heard me less, and assumed grief had broken me. Let them believe it. The less they suspected, the sharper my strike would be. Sometimes I walked the edge of the property under the guise of passing through. Snow crunched beneath my boots, the fields white and still. I studied the barns, the fences, the sagging roof lines, not with despair, but with a craftsman's eye. I could already see the repairs, the restoration, the life the land could still give if it were in patient hands. My hands, and as I stood there, the wind cold against my face, I whispered into the silence, "Soon, Father. Soon it will be mine again." But patience required more than hope. It required allies. So I visited the banker quietly, not Martin's banker mind. A man who had watched me work carpentry jobs for decades, who knew my reputation for paying debts before they came due. I laid my savings before him, neat and modest. I asked him calm and measured to prepare for the auction. He looked at me surprised. "You mean to bid, Richard?" I met his gaze, my voice steady. "I mean to finish what my father began?" The banker nodded slowly. Respect flickered in his eyes, not pity respect. And in that moment, I knew the silence I had carried all these months had not been wasted. That night, I returned home, the fire glowing low, my ledger complete. I closed the book with a soft thud and sat in the stillness. The world believed I was finished. My brother believed I was a ghost. But ghosts have a way of haunting the living. And when the auctioneer's gavel fell, my silence would break at last with one bid. The notice was posted. The date was set. The Hale farm, the very soil where my father's hands once bled, would be sold at auction. To Martin, it was a misstep he could drink away. To me, it was the moment I had been waiting for. The days leading up to it passed in a silence sharper than any storm. I lived simply bread, coffee, and the warmth of the stove. Each evening I reviewed my notes, rehearsing in my mind the rhythm of the auctioneer's chant, the right moment to raise my hand, the point at which silence would cut sharper than words. I kept my life so ordinary that no one suspected. At the diner, I sipped coffee quietly. At church, I bowed my head in prayer, lips unmoving. I answered no questions, started no conversations. To the world, I was the old man fading into winter. But inside, I was sharpening the blade of patience. Martin, meanwhile, grew louder. Pride always does before the fall. "They won't dare take Hale land," he boasted at the diner, whiskey already on his breath, though it was morning. "I'll settle it. Don't worry about me." The men around him nodded politely, but their eyes betrayed doubt. They had seen too many like him, men who believed their name was stronger than debt. His sons followed suit. One cornered me outside the church and smirked. "Uncle, maybe you should stay home on auction day. Wouldn't want the cold to trouble your old bones." I looked at him calm and steady and said nothing, because words are wasted on boys who have never broken their backs in frozen soil. On the morning of the auction, I rose before dawn. The air was crisp, the frost biting the sky painted pale gray. I dressed simply clean shirt wool, coat-worn boots. No more, no less. At the table, I placed my hand on the ledger, the record of every debt, every betrayal, every insult. I closed it, slid it into the drawer, and left it behind. The time for recording had passed. The time for action had come. As I walked into town, snow crunched underfoot. Each breath rose white into the air, dissolving quickly, like all the words I had never spoken. The courthouse loomed ahead, tall and solemn, its steps worn by decades of men who had lost and gained everything inside. The auction room was warm, filled with the smell of sweat, wool, and anticipation. Men sat in rows, hats in hand, voices low with speculation. The banker nodded to me as I entered, respect in his eyes, but no surprise. He knew I belonged here. I sat in the back, silent. My presence drew little attention. Just an old man seeking warmth, perhaps. Martin, on the other hand, sat near the front, loud, brash, slapping shoulders and grinning as if the day were his celebration. "They'll see," he whispered to his sons. "Hale land isn't for sale. Not really. But arrogance does not pay debts." The auctioneer stood at the podium, gavel in hand, voice carrying across the room. The bidding began, small parcels, first names called, numbers rising. Men lifted their hands, some confident, some hesitant, some bluffing with money they didn't have. I listened, measured, learned the rhythm again. Then came the words I had waited for. Next item, the Hale Farm South, tract 200 acres. The room stirred. Hats shifted, whispers spread. Some men straightened in their seats, others leaned back calculating. Martin leaned forward, his face flushed, as if daring anyone to challenge him. The auctioneer began. The first bid came quick, a neighbor hoping for a bargain. Another followed. Martin raised his hand, voice loud, confident. "Mine." The room fell silent. Few dared bid against a man so bold, even one drowning in debt. They didn't see the weakness beneath his bravado. They didn't know what I knew, but I did. I waited. The auctioneer called again, voice sharp echoing. "Do I have another bid?" Silence stretched. Men shifted uncomfortably. Martin smirked, already certain of his victory. Then, slowly, deliberately, I raised my hand. The room turned. Eyes widened. Whispers rippled through the rows. An old man silent for months, suddenly alive in the bidding. Martin's smirk faltered just slightly. "Richard, you." But the auctioneer cut him off with a firm nod. "We have a new bid." The gavel poised, the air thick with tension. I didn't look at Martin. I didn't look at his sons. My eyes stayed on the podium, steady, calm, patient. Because this wasn't about pride. This was about justice. The auctioneer called again, waiting. No hands rose, no voices challenged. Martin looked around, desperate for support, but found none. Even his sons stayed silent, their bravado wilting. The gavel fell once, twice, sold. The word rang through the room like thunder. I lowered my hand, calm, deliberate, and finally turned my eyes toward Martin. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his glass confidence shattered. I said nothing, because silence was the loudest voice I could give him. That night, I returned home. The ledger still sat in the drawer waiting. I pulled it out, opened to the last page, and wrote one line. The land is mine again by silence, by patience, by one bid. I closed the book, fed the fire, and sat back. Outside, the snow continued to fall soft and steady. But inside, for the first time in years, I felt warmth that came not from the fire, but from justice. Defeat does not come to a proud man all at once. It seeps in like water through a cracked roof, drop by drop, until the whole house caves. For Martin, the first crack was silence. After the gavel fell, after the room cleared, no one congratulated him. No one patted his back. No one lifted a glass to his name. The men who once laughed at his jokes, who nodded at his boasts, slipped past him without a word. They glanced at me, some with surprise, some with respect, but none dared meet Martin's eyes. I walked out quietly, my boots steady on the courthouse floor. Behind me, I heard his voice low, desperate, trying to convince his sons that it wasn't over. But his words had no weight, not anymore. The next week, the whispers began. At the diner, the talk was no longer about old Richard, but about Martin's ruin. How could he lose land that had been in the family for generations? Drank it away, gambled it away, promised more than he had. Richard was the smart one all along. I sat in the corner, sipping my coffee, saying nothing. Martin sat near the front shoulders, tense, his boys silent beside him. They no longer laughed. They no longer jeered. They stared at their plates, knowing every word spoken was true. Shame spreads faster than fire. At church, Martin's pew was half empty. His sons shuffled uncomfortably as neighbors avoided their gaze. The pastor spoke of humility of pride before the fall, and though he never said Martin's name, everyone heard it between the lines. After service, a woman approached me, her voice soft. "Mr. Hale, the land is better in your hands. Your father would be proud." I nodded, thanked her, and walked away. Not because I didn't feel the weight of her words, but because I knew Martin was standing close enough to hear them. And silence once again was sharper than any blade. Martin tried to save face. He told anyone who would listen that the loss was temporary, that he'd buy the land back by summer. But the town no longer believed him. Credit dried up. The banker, once patient, turned cold. Debts came due one by one, and Martin's pockets held nothing but excuses. I watched it all quietly, never gloating, never boasting. I didn't need to. The land spoke for me. The people spoke for me. Even Martin's silence spoke for me. One evening, I passed the farm. The porch light flickered weak and dim. The barn door sagged, lower one hinge broken, swaying in the wind. Martin stood outside, coat too thin for the cold, a bottle dangling from his hand. He didn't see me in the shadows. He muttered to himself words, slurred, cursing the bank, cursing the town, cursing me. But I felt no anger, only a quiet, steady resolve. Because revenge is not the pleasure of seeing a man suffer. It is the dignity of restoring what was stolen. My nephews fared no better. Their pride, once loud and cutting, crumbled under the weight of reality. The same men they mocked me with now avoided them. Employers in town turned them away. "Hale boys can't be trusted," they said. "Look what they did with their own father's land." One of them passed me on the street, his head low, his voice bitter. "You planned this, didn't you, Saturday there, waiting for us to fail?" I stopped, looked him in the eye, and spoke for the first time in months. My voice was calm, steady, unshaken. "I didn't plan your failure. I only waited for it." He had no answer. He turned and walked away. The farm itself began to change under my hands. I mended the fences Martin had let sag. I repaired the barn roof, each hammer strike echoing into the cold air like a hymn. I walked the fields, the soil crunching under snow, imagining the spring to come. Neighbors noticed. They saw the land cared for again the way it used to be. And with every nail driven, with every post set straight, their respect grew louder. Not in words, but in silence, in nods, in the way they treated me once more as a man, not a relic. Martin, meanwhile, shrank. The man who once filled rooms with his voice now sat at the diner in silence. The man who once mocked me in front of the church now lingered at the back, eyes lowered. The man who once claimed I was too old, too weak, too useless, now walked past me on the street without a word. That was his downfall. Not the loss of land, not the weight of debt, but the silence of a community that no longer saw him. And through it all, I never raised my voice. Never gloated, never mocked him as he once mocked me. Because true revenge doesn't need noise. It only needs patience. And patience at last was mine to harvest. Downfall does not arrive with thunder. It arrives quietly the way frost kills a crop silent and certain. By spring, Martin's fall was complete. The first blow came from the bank. Notices tacked to his door read ink across the page delinquent. Past due. His sons ripped them down in anger, but the papers returned each week, each one sharper than the last. Then came the creditors. The feed store, the equipment dealer, the men he had borrowed from on promises of harvest that never came. They came knocking not with threats, but with disappointment. And disappointment cuts deeper than anger. Martin tried to bluff them the way he always had. Loud words, puffed chest, empty promises. But men had stopped believing him. They saw through the bravado. They turned away, shaking their heads, leaving him standing in his doorway with nothing but silence behind them. The second blow came from his own sons. Pride can bind men together, but when pride rots, loyalty goes with it. David, the loudest of them, left first. Packed his things in the middle of the night, muttering about finding work in the city. The others followed in weeks, each one slipping away like rats from a sinking ship. I saw Martin once standing alone on that porch, his sons gone, the house quiet. His shoulders sagged, his face hollow. The man who once mocked me with laughter now stared at the empty road as if waiting for someone who would never return. I did not speak to him. There was nothing to say. His downfall was not my hand, it was his own. The final blow came from the town itself. No one invited him to sit at their table in the diner. No one welcomed him after church. Even the children whispered his name with ridicule the way they once whispered mine. The man who had believed himself untouchable was now invisible, and in that silence I walked among them again, not as a ghost, but as a man restored. The farm under my care began to breathe once more. I mended fences. I repaired barns. I tilled the soil with patience, listening to the earth the way my father taught me. Neighbors saw me working at dawn, saw the steady rhythm of a man who had not forgotten, and they nodded. Some offered help, others simply watched with respect. The land responded. Shoots of green pierced the thawing soil. The cattle grew stronger under steady hands. The farm, once in ruin, began to heal. And as it healed, so did my name. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the fields in gold, an old neighbor stopped at the fence line. He leaned on the post, watching me drive nails into a gate. "Richard," he said, voice soft, "it's good to see the land in your hands again. Feels right." I nodded, wiped sweat from my brow, and simply replied, "The land remembers who tends it," because that was the truth. The soil does not care for names on papers or words shouted in anger. It cares for sweat, for patience, for hands that keep working long after others quit. Martin drifted through town like a shadow. He still carried his body upright, still tried to meet eyes with confidence, but everyone saw the hollowness beneath. He no longer spoke loudly. He no longer mocked. He walked quickly, head low, a man undone, not by another's hand, but by his own. I did not chase him. I did not gloat. Revenge was not in his suffering, it was in my restoration. And I was restored. The day I walked the full boundary of the farm again, I stopped at the old north field, the one Martin had once sold in parcels. I ran my hand over the fence post, weathered and rough, and I whispered, "It's mine again, Father." Not by force, not by anger, by patience. The wind carried across the grass, soft and steady, as if answering. Martin's downfall was complete. His sons gone, his debts unpaid, his pride broken, and yet I bore him no hatred. Only a quiet certainty that silence had spoken louder than his years of boasting, because in the end the land had chosen, and it had chosen me. When spring came, the fields breathed again. Snow melted into the soil, trickling down to roots that had survived the long freeze. The grass grew tall, green, alive as though the land itself had been waiting for me, just as I had waited for it. I walked those acres at dawn, boots damp with dew hands, brushing against young stalks. Every step felt like a return, every breath, a reminder that the soil had not forgotten me. And I realized then, revenge is not about taking from another man, it is about restoring what was stolen from you. The townspeople no longer spoke of Martin. His name, once loud in every corner, now slipped away like dust in the wind. They spoke instead of the farm how it was mended, how it grew strong again, how it seemed alive with dignity once more. Neighbors came by, some offering a hand, others simply standing at the fence watching quietly. They did not speak much, and I did not need them to. Their silence was respect, the very respect Martin had tried to strip from me. At the diner, men who once laughed with my brother now nodded to me. At church, the pew beside mine was no longer empty. And though I said little, my presence spoke for itself. I had become what Martin never understood, not a ghost, not a relic, but a man who had outlasted betrayal. One evening, I sat at my table, the ledger open before me. The pages were filled, debts, recorded insults written down, the timeline of betrayal mapped like a scar. I ran my hand over the final line. The land is mine again, by silence, by patience, by one bid. Then I closed the book, slowly, deliberately. For years, that ledger had been my weapon, my way of keeping score when no one else would. But now, I no longer needed it. The land itself was my ledger. Every blade of grass, every repaired fence, every calf born in spring, each one a record of my patience. I placed the book in a drawer, locked it, and left it there. Because my revenge was complete. Martin still walked the town though, smaller now. His steps slower, his eyes downcast. He never spoke to me again, not once. And I never spoke to him. There was nothing left to say. Words could not change the years we had lived, could not restore the trust he had broken. Silence was the only answer fitting for us both. But sometimes when I saw him pass by, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not anger, but pity. Because pride had made him blind. And blindness in the end had been his undoing. The land taught me something as it always had. That revenge does not have to be loud. It does not have to be cruel. Sometimes the sharpest revenge is patience itself, to let a man's own choices bury him while you rise quietly in their shadow. I did not shout, I did not fight, I waited. And waiting gave me everything. One night I stood by the barn lantern light, casting long shadows. The field stretched before me dark and vast, the stars sharp against the sky. I thought of Father, of his steady hands, of the way he said, "The land rewards patience, Richard." I whispered into the night, my voice low but steady. "You were right, Father. It did. It always does." The wind moved through the grass, soft and slow, as if answering. And in that moment, I knew my story was not just mine. It was a lesson, a warning. A quiet truth carried through the soil itself. Silence is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. And revenge, when it comes, can be as slow and certain as the changing of seasons. There comes a time when a man must put down his burdens, not because they are too heavy, but because he has carried them far enough. For me, that time came when the farm stood whole again. The fields grew strong through spring into summer. Wheat waved golden in the wind, fences stood tall and straight, and the barns held firm against storms. The cattle were fat and healthy, their coats gleaming in the sun. Each morning I rose with the dawn as I once had with Father. The rhythm returned the land, the work, the silence. But this time it was not out of sacrifice or duty. It was out of choice. Because the farm was mine again, not in name alone, but in truth. The town changed too. Men who once looked through me now met my eyes with quiet respect. Neighbors greeted me with nods, with the kind of acknowledgement that carries no words but says everything. Children who once laughed at Martin's jokes at my expense now chased along my fences, waving as I passed. And in the diner where humiliation once filled the air, silence followed when I entered, not out of scorn, but out of reverence. Not because I had shouted or fought or demanded it, but because I had endured. Martin, however, was no longer the man he once pretended to be. I saw him sometimes sitting alone at the far end of the diner, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. His shoulders hunched, his voice quiet. The laughter that once filled rooms had gone. His sons had scattered his debt, swallowed what little remained, and the town had turned his back. He never looked at me, and I never forced him to. There is no satisfaction in pressing a beaten man. Revenge was not about his suffering. It was about reclaiming what was mine, restoring dignity where it had been stripped. And I had done that. One evening, as the sun set low, I walked the boundary of the farm. The sky burned orange and red, the earth warm beneath my boots. I stopped at the north field, the place where Martin had first begun to sell away our legacy. I leaned against the fence post, weathered but sturdy, and I spoke softly as if to the soil itself. "You see, Father, silence was never surrender. It was my weapon, and patience was the blade." The wind stirred the tall grass, swaying in slow rhythm. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I felt as though he stood beside me, nodding, satisfied. I returned to the house, lit the lantern, and opened the drawer where the ledger lay. For the last time, I held it in my hands. The weight of it, the years of bitterness, the record of betrayal pressed against my palms. I set it on the table, opened to the last page, and read the words I had written. The land is mine again, by silence, by patience, by one bid. Then I closed it, slid it back into the drawer, and this time I locked it not out of necessity, but out of closure. The ledger belonged to the past, and the past had no claim on me anymore. As the fire crackled low, I thought of everything that had passed. The laughter, the betrayal, the humiliation, the silence, and the patient revenge that followed. It all formed a single truth, a truth I would carry to my final days. That silence is not weakness, that patience is not surrender, that dignity is never lost if you are willing to endure. I did not seek glory. I did not seek applause. All I wanted was justice, slow, deliberate, certain. And in the end, I had it. Martin had his downfall. I had my restoration. And the land had its keeper back. So if there is one lesson in my story, it is this. When they tell you that you are finished, that you are too old, too weak, too forgotten, let them talk. Let them laugh. Let them believe, and then wait. Wait as winter waits. Wait as the land waits. Because time, patience, and silence will do what anger never can. And when the season turns, when the moment comes, you will stand where they once stood, not with rage, not with noise, but with quiet certainty. The kind of certainty that makes even the proudest men bow their heads. That is how I reclaimed my name. That is how I reclaimed my land. That is how silence became my greatest revenge.